Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Gabriel De Marco about various manipulation cases and different ways philosophers have responded to them. We also talk about real-life cases of interventions that are similar to the manipulations in philosophical thought experiments.
I'm happy to introduce Gabriel De Marco, who is currently a research fellow in applied moral philosophy at the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. Gabe received his PhD in philosophy from Florida State University, and he has published several articles on issues in free will and moral responsibility, including several on manipulation. Some of his recent work has focused on the effect neurointerventions may have on the subject's autonomy and moral responsibility, which we'll make sure to ask about later in the interview today. Welcome to the show, Gabe. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure. Yeah. I got interested in stuff about free will when I was a grad student at Florida State. Pretty much everybody was talking about free will at that point because that's a pretty big on free will, that department. I initially really did not like it. And then eventually I came around to it. I think I was sort of interested in some questions about, I think, authenticity and what it means to act authentically and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to some of the stuff on manipulation arguments and things like that. Now I just don't like the term authenticity, but I still focus on some of that stuff. So my dissertation was on cases of manipulated agents and the problems they might pose for theories of free will and moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I try to avoid the manipulation argument in general now, but I do focus on manipulation cases and how we might either account for our intuitions or determine when we should kind of bite the bullet. Once I graduated, I got this job here at the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics, and I've gotten quite a bit more into practical ethics. And there's some very smart people here that have shown me a whole bunch of interesting problems to think about. So some of my work has had to do with these non-consensual neurocorrectives. So interventions that you might make on offenders to try to rehabilitate them. That was one of the kind of projects I worked on. Some of my work has been on the use of responsibility in healthcare. So to put it very briefly, suppose you've got, say, one liver to offer to somebody who needs a liver transplant, and now you've got two people that need the liver transplant. One is just from some health issue that they've had that they had no control over, and another one has just had problems with alcohol in the past and may or may not be responsible for it. Let's suppose that they are responsible for it. Who should we give the liver to? Well, one thought is maybe we should take into account the fact that the one person might be responsible for the behavior that led to that. But I have a few papers on that topic. And now some of my more current work has to do with, right now I'm looking more at nudging. So there's this policy of nudging where looking at insights from like behavioral economics where you can make some modifications to the what's often called the choice environment. You can make it more likely that agents will act in one way rather than another. So if, say, when filling out your paperwork for getting your license, you're asked whether you want to become an organ donor or not, if you have to tick the box to become an organ donor, you might be less likely to become an organ donor than if you have to tick the box to opt out. Right? So the default will, whatever the default is, will make you more likely to pick the default. So those sorts of influences aren't always clearly say reason engaging. They might not always engage the agent's capacities for recognizing or reacting to reasons. So those raise some interesting issues, I think. On the free will stuff, I'm always going to keep, I don't know if I always will, but I keep working on stuff about cases of manipulation and how best to deal with them.
Yeah. Cool. Well, on that note, we've talked about cases of manipulation on the podcast before, but always in the context of manipulation argument against compatibilism. Before that argument was formulated and widely discussed, though, manipulation cases were used to challenge particular accounts of freedom and responsibility and to motivate the idea that an agent's history matters for whether they're free and responsible. Could you describe this sort of manipulation case and what you take it to show?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of different manipulation cases, and I think the different features of those cases will show different things. In some cases that sometimes people might think are not manipulation cases, but they still get talked about in that context, like the cases of Ernie and Diana. So here's a common one from Al Mealy uses this one a lot. So you've got, consider Pat, who's a mediocre father. He'll sometimes do things with his children, but he just doesn't find himself too motivated to do things for them or do things with them. He recognizes that he doesn't like that. He doesn't like being that way. And so he tries to think, how can I become a better father? He considers some options, comes up with a plan, implements it, and over the years he becomes like a really good father. So good that today his daughter has told him that she wants to go to a particularly expensive liberal arts college, and he decides that he's going to take out a loan to help her do so. And when he does that, he has what Al calls a Luther-style inability to do otherwise. So he sees the situation clearly, and his capacities for control are not impaired, such that in all relevantly similar circumstances, he would still choose that way. Now compare Pat to Paul. Paul is also a mediocre father, doesn't care much about his doing things with his children. He has some selfish desires that often lead him to act contrary to what would be, say, in the best interest of his children or something like that. Some neuroscientists, maybe hired by his mother, wants him to be more like Pat, the good father. And so they find out what it is that makes Pat tick, what it is about, say, the structure of his brain or the way that his brain operates or something like that, and his set of values. And then while Paul is asleep, the neuroscientist goes in, modifies Paul's brain to kind of mirror, at least in the relevant respects, Pat's brain or mental states. So now he has all these parental values. And he also implants further, say, second-order attitudes about those attitudes that support the having of those values and acting on those parental values. And he deletes competing desires. So then Paul wakes up. He now has this whole new set of values, or at least substantially modified values. He recalls that his daughter just got into a very expensive liberal arts college. He knows that she can only go if he takes out a substantial loan. And he sees that he has a strong desire to do so. He thinks it's a bit weird that he now has this desire, which yesterday he wouldn't have had. Right. He thinks about it somewhat. He realizes that he has now seen the light of the value of father-daughter relationships, and endorses these. Of course, that evaluation itself is influenced by the further implanted states. And so he decides to take out the loan, and he also could not have done otherwise in the same way that Pat could not have done otherwise. It seems like Paul is not free or responsible when it comes to making that decision, yet Pat is. Some people reject that. That's fine. But for a lot of people, they'll think Paul is not responsible or free with respect to that action or that decision. And then the question is, how do we account for that? So some people, again, they might just not think that Paul lacks freedom or responsibility. If so, then there's nothing to account for. If you think that, then you might think that there's something to account for. It looks like you can't account for it in terms of what are often called synchronic features of the agents. So features that the agent has at the time and that he has maybe irrespective of what their past was like. I mean, there might be some further complications there, but we can put those to the side. So, for instance, their ability to respond or recognize reasons in favor or against various actions, the control they have at the time, or maybe the abilities that they have at the time. All of those are identical across Pat and Paul. So if you want to account for Paul's lack of responsibility while still being able to say that Pat is responsible or free, then you're probably going to need to point out to some difference that is not stated in terms of those abilities. Sorry. There's two main ways of trying to do that. Now, there's other responses to manipulation arguments. One response is just to say we can come up with these cases that meet incompatibilist conditions in indeterministic universes. I find those cases fairly convincing for these types of cases where it's an adult agent is manipulated in these ways. So this is part of why I might avoid the manipulation argument, because I think it's a problem for pretty much everybody that thinks that free will, moral responsibility is possible. At least these cases. So the two main theories, I categorize them in these ways. It's a rough distinction, but it's useful enough for getting past the intro of papers. So there's what I call bypassing views, and then there's what I call manipulator-focused views. So manipulator-focused views, in order to explain why Paul is not responsible, they appeal to the presence of some manipulating agent and their intention, or their intention, not always their intention. So the problem, what's going to explain why Paul doesn't act freely or responsibly is going to be stated in terms of the fact that there was an agent that maybe intended for him to act in this way and had the ability to make him do that, say by doing this neurosurgery or something like that. That sort of view sometimes faces the issue of what we might call blind force cases or natural force cases. So sometimes people point to these cases where, for instance, suppose that Paul, there was no neuroscientist, he just was on a cruise going through the Bermuda Triangle, and he undergoes the same exact change while he sleeps. That's Mealy's case. If we think that this version of Paul is also not free or responsible for deciding to take out the loan, then we're not going to be able to explain it by appeal to some manipulator, because there is no manipulator. So we're going to need to do something else. The second set of views, which do better, I think, on the blind force cases, are what I call bypassing views. And these views, what they have in common is roughly that their explanation will say that part of the reason why Paul is not responsible or free is because his action issues from attitudes that were acquired in a way that bypasses capacities for control over his mental life. And these capacities are, people have different lists, but roughly the capacities to evaluate, assess, and possibly endorse the newly implanted attitudes. That that set of capacities is McKenna's list. So I say that that's partly the reason, because all of these views are going to have some further ingredient. So a lot of our attitudes in everyday life, it seems, might be either acquired or modified via bypassing. Maybe not, but it seems like a lot of them will be, in which case, if that was sufficient to undermine responsibility for actions issuing from those attitudes, then we would rarely, if ever, be responsible for our actions, or we would rarely or ever act freely. So it seems like what we need is to say that mere bypassing or acting from attitudes that were acquired via bypassing won't be enough to undermine freedom or responsibility. We need to add something further. Often people will say things that suggest that the significance of the change that happened via bypassing is going to be relevant. So if the change is quite small, say it's a single desire of moderate or weak strength, and you act on it, then that's probably not going to be enough to undermine responsibility or freedom. If it's a fairly significant change, say that the desire is quite strong. In the case of Paul, it's one of these extreme cases, right? So he has pretty strong desires that were modified, that were added. The competing desires were eliminated. And further, there were these other desires that support the parental values that were also implanted. So the changes to his set of values is pretty significant there. So that's going to be enough to undermine, at least on some views.
Great, thanks. So far we've seen there are sort of two views about moral responsibility. One that says the conditions are synchronic. So what matters is the agent's abilities at the time of action. And then another that says, well, no, there's some historical element to moral responsibility. And you've mentioned there are sort of two historical ways to look at manipulation or to respond to manipulation. One that says what's going on in cases where an agent's responsibility is undermined is, there's another agent involved, right? This is the manipulator-focused response. But then you've just now explained a little bit more about bypassing views. I was going to see if you could say a little bit more about the different kinds of bypassing views. I'm sure there are more than one view on offer. So do you want to go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess one minor detail is that I take it that a lot more people will think that history matters for responsibility than people who think that something like a bypassing view is correct. So insofar as you can be indirectly responsible for things, say responsible for doing something where that responsibility fully derives from some previous action or something like that, then history is going to matter. So this is more about direct responsibility.
Good.
So what are some of the distinctions that we can make? So one distinction that is quite common and I think is kind of relevant for maybe some of the issues they face is there's positive historical views and negative historical views. Now when I talk about historical views, I just mean bypassing views. So a positive historical view requires that you have had a certain type of history in order to act freely or responsibly. A negative view only requires that in order to act freely or responsibly, you need to have lacked a certain type of history. So one of the cases that's often used to distinguish between two types of views is cases of instant agents, right? So suppose we have a third agent, call him Saul, there is some very powerful being that just creates someone that is pretty much a clone of Paul the day after the manipulation. He then considers these desires, sees that he's seen the light. Of course, his memories about the past are all false because he has no past. and he decides to take out this loan. Well, this agent basically has no past. If so, on a negative historical view, that is not an impediment to him acting freely or responsibly here. Insofar as he doesn't have the wrong sort of past, he can act freely and responsibly. On a positive view, on the other hand, given that he has no past, he doesn't have the right sort of past, and so he won't act freely or responsibly. The case of Paul, I think, is a little bit tricky because he does, before deciding, actually evaluate these desires or these parental values. So at least one version of the positive historical view might also suggest that he acts freely or responsibly. But suppose that he didn't evaluate those, he just wakes up with these parental values and decides to take out this loan to help out his daughter, then he wouldn't be responsible on a positive view.
Gotcha.
You mentioned that manipulator-focused views have a hard time with natural force cases like the Bermuda Triangle case. Are there any hard cases for bypassing theorists?
Yeah, but I'll also add another small little note here. So one, it's a bit unfair to say that, I think, about manipulator-focused views. So I think a lot of the manipulator-focused views do face that problem, but it's not clear that all of them do. In particular, there's one by Oisin Deary and Eddie Namias that will be able to handle, it seems, at least some cases of blind forces, in part because they're not literally a manipulator-focused view. Like I said, that's a rough characterization.
Sure.
But they care more about causal sources. Okay, so do I think there's problems that the bypassing views can't handle? Yeah. Or problems that they have.
Yeah.
Yes. So one sort of case, which is a different sort of case, are cases of original design. So a lot of the debate has just moved to those now. So these usually take place in a deterministic universe, although I think Taylor has a case which doesn't. And so suppose there's a goddess Diana who wants event E to happen 30 years in the future. She has full knowledge of the laws of the universe, and she has full knowledge of the current state of the universe, and she has these super fantastic powers of processing all that information to figure out how to get E to come about. She determines that the way she's going to do it is if she modifies or creates, I can't remember which it is, I don't think it matters, a zygote that is in Mary in a particular way, then this zygote will turn into Ernie, who will, 30 years in the future, perform action A, and action A will bring about event E. So one question is, does when Ernie A's, or performs action A, does he do it freely, and is he responsible for it? And it seems like we have the intuition that he's not. If so, then we need to come up with an explanation for that, or we just bite the bullet, right? Manipulator-focused views often do focus on precisely this sort of case, and they do have the resources available for at least some versions of this case to say, here's why Ernie is not responsible, whereas Bernie, who is just a typical agent in a deterministic universe that came about in the normal way, he has, say, the same exact life as Ernie, right? Does all the same things, thinks all the same things. When he acts freely, and the way to explain the difference is by pointing to the presence of a manipulator. Bypassing views cannot account for that. And the reason for that is because all of the relevant work is done before the agent before the agent comes into existence, or before the agent has any of the relevant agential capacities that we might care about.
Right.
At least for these purposes. So it's not as though Diana, by modifying the zygote that's in Mary, somehow bypass the zygote's capacities for control over its mental life and produce a significant change in the zygote's values. The zygote has no values. It doesn't have these capacities. So there's just not really a way for a bypassing view to account for it. So that's one sort of problem, which is often used to distinguish between those two types of views.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's what I might call avenues for further research. And I think divide those into different groups. So one area for further research is usually these views focus on cases like Pat and Paul. And they want to explain why Paul does not act freely the day after the manipulation, at least when it comes to making this decision about taking out the loan. But they don't typically focus on what happens with Paul for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Will he ever act freely on the basis of these attitudes? Will he ever be responsible for this sort of thing?
Right.
And I think it's going to be kind of important to try to figure that out, because it seems like maybe eventually he could.
Right.
So sometimes people mention something very briefly about this. I think the most extensive thing I've seen is Al's discussion of this case, and he doesn't really give a condition. He just gives a case where it happens, right? So suppose that a year later, Paul has been living his life in accordance with these values, and he recognizes that this is ultimately what makes him happiest, and his value for a happy life is something that he had prior to the manipulation. That's something that continued on.
Mm-hmm.
So now that he has this experience with a set of values, he's performed all these actions on the basis of it. He's in a much better position to know that this is what makes his life happiest, and now he identifies and endorses them. So this might be a case where now Paul can start to act freely on the basis of these attitudes, and maybe it happens a bit before, maybe it happens a while before, but I mean, this is just one story that shows how this happened. I think one of the tricky bits about this has to do with describing the nature of that process. How is it that he comes to be free and responsible with those, with respect to these actions again? In part, it's because there's this issue with what happens with Paul the day after, right? So he wakes up and he recognizes that these values are new and different,
Right.
and he evaluates them, and he ends up endorsing them, right? So nothing that you get in Al's story would suggest that this is a case where he comes to be free or responsible for these actions, but he does seem to have an opportunity to evaluate the parental values in light of further values that he has, or further, say, desires that he has, by using his principles for deliberation and so on. So it seems like he has a sort of robust ability and opportunity to evaluate these attitudes. So it's not done. So I think one thing we can say is that evaluation is not done in light of, or at least that evaluation is significantly influenced by other attitudes that were further implanted attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this isn't a case of Paul coming to be free or responsible with respect to these the actions issuing from these attitudes. But later on it is, because he's evaluated it in light of an attitude that was not implanted. I think one issue there, and this gets maybe into the weeds, but I mentioned it in one of my papers, is that There's a further case where it seems like agents can undergo significant changes like this without having any new attitudes. So basically what you do is you erase, say, Pat's parental values. So now he only has selfish attitudes. He might undergo as radical of a change. A lot of the same things that we could say about Paul, we would apply to this agent, which I call Matt. And so there I offer some ways in which we could revise bypassing views, the ones that are on offer, to account for this sort of case. I think the problem, if one thinks that we need to account for that sort of case, and I think that insofar as we care about the case of Pat Paul, we should care about the case of Matt, because it's just not super clear to me what all the difference, that there's too much of a relevant difference here.
Yeah.
If we want to account for that case, then suppose that Matt wakes up and evaluates his attitudes and all that. Well, given that his parental values were deleted, and further suppose that the other attitudes that would support those parental values were deleted, which you might just think are also parental values. So he evaluates he sees, oh, look, I today I'm going to go take out a loan for a car. This is weird because I could take out a loan to help out my daughter, which I would have done yesterday, but today I won't. Why? Suppose he's come to see the light about the value of Lamborghinis or something. I don't know. Whatever. Just a similar story to the one you get in the poll. It still seems that he's not free or responsible, or at least it's not clear what difference we could point to.
Right.
That's that significant. I think, and maybe a side note here, Paul was a mediocre dad before the manipulation. He wasn't a terrible dad.
Yeah.
So he already had parental values, right? The modification is not necessarily to implant radically new values, but maybe change your strengths and delete some competing ones. And so this is part of why I think it seems a huge difference. Well, in the case of Matt, he doesn't have any new attitudes. You might think there's this new attitude of indifference. I give a brief response to that objection. I don't really want to get into it here. I think it gets super complicated, and I'm not super convinced by my response. But let's suppose that I'm right. Then, again, consider the evaluation that he has the day after the manipulation, right? He evaluates his selfish attitudes. He sees that he endorses it. He sees that he really doesn't want to take out the loan for his daughter. Well, that evaluation all happens in light of previously non-implanted states. So if all you need to get a person to be free or responsible from these, for actions that issue from these attitudes, like if all you need is for Paul to become free and responsible is for him to evaluate those previous attitudes or the parental values in light of the happiness or something like this, then it seems like Matt does that the day after the manipulation. Right. What you might do is add a further condition, something like the difference between Paul a year later and Matt the day after the manipulation is that Paul has now had all these experiences with acting on these desires and on the parental values and seeing their effects and seeing how much like value brings into his life or something like that. In which case that might be a way of making a difference. But I do think, I mean, that's this in general is going to be one place for further research, just trying to figure out how one can regain freedom and responsibility for these sorts of actions without getting into this problem with Matt. I think this is further exacerbated by, there's a problem that, I mean, I mentioned in a paper that, and Taylor gets into in one of his papers. So I think this is mainly a problem for positive views, but when you have a positive view requiring a certain type of history in order to be free or responsible, then you have to do something to explain how an agent can perform their first free action.
Mm-hmm.
If we all perform free actions, then presumably, unless we're infinite beings, there is a first one, which means that by that time, we need to have had the right sort of history. Often, so with positive views, what McKenna and Fisher talk about are some sort of opportunity or other to evaluate or assess the attitudes, or to filter them through one's evaluative scheme. In order for us to have our first free action, we need to have had that opportunity prior to that action on these views, on positive views. Now, if we perform our first reactions, say when we're kids, maybe when we're teens, I don't know when it happens. Let's just say it happens when we're teens. Then it can't. Then it's going to be the sort of opportunity involving, say, the sorts of abilities that those agents already have. Now, when it comes to those abilities, it would seem that someone like Paul already has those abilities as well, maybe to a greater extent. So then why is it that when he evaluates his desires the day after the manipulation, that doesn't count as the right sort of opportunity? And again, I take it part of the answer is going to have to do with the fact that that evaluation is significantly influenced by further implanted states. But I still have to try to figure out how exactly to work out that part of the view. It's not super clear to me yet. It's like there's issues. I take it that this tension, so there's this tension between the opportunity that the agent needs to have for the first action and the opportunity that they have the day after the manipulation. That can't be enough to fulfill that opportunity requirement. That tension between those, which I think is a tension because it's going to be difficult to figure out what the nature of this opportunity is such that younger agents can fulfill it, and younger agents who it's not clear where they got their values either.
Right.
But where younger agents can fulfill it, and these case agents like Paul can't or don't. Figuring that out, I think, is going to be tricky. But with a negative historical view, it's not clear to me that that problem arises, in part because they don't require a history, and they don't require that you have had a certain sort of history in order to act freely or responsibly. So insofar as, Al's view is a negative historical view, Al Mealy, and on that view, he says it's only meant to handle these cases of extreme manipulation, but it really delineates a fairly significant change that occurs via bypassing. And that just doesn't seem to happen with us as little kids, in which case it's not clear that that's going to be a problem for that sort of view. At least the tension between the opportunity that an agent needs to meet in order to perform their first reaction and the opportunity that the manipulated agent has the day after the manipulation. Is that clear? Is that
that's great. Unsurprisingly, I think those are great avenues for further research. And I should say, I think the case of Matt and the paper where you introduced that case is ingenious, and we'll link it in the show notes for people who want to go see the details. We should move on now to talking about. Oh, go ahead.
Well, okay. So the one further avenue for research, I'll be really brief about this. So I think one thing, there's a couple. One is we need to, I think, maybe get a clearer account of what it means to engage or bypass these capacities, and what that account looks like is going to determine a lot of what it means to bypass these capacities and how often it actually happens in real life. Another avenue is going to be I think that in a case of Paul, suppose you say he's not free or responsible, where I think, okay, so now we have this necessary condition. But then you might start wondering about all these other cases where you ramp down the manipulation. And it's not anywhere near as significant. But maybe we think something like, well, maybe he's not as responsible as another agent. Maybe like a correlate like Paul. And if that's the case, then I think bypassing views are in a position to kind of say something about those cases and why. But that's not something that's been done yet, and it's one thing I'm trying to work on.
Yeah.
Nice.
Very interesting.
That's actually a good segue for what I wanted to move on to next, which is the case of non-consensual neurocorrectives. So the cases that we've been talking about so far, the manipulation cases like Pat, Paul, Saul, Matt, all these guys, they might seem far-fetched. But in recent work, you've discussed a type of intervention called non-consensual neurocorrectives, or NNs for short, which are already possible and in some cases legal. So could you give some examples of NNs and maybe say why anyone would be motivated to use them in real life?
Yeah. So this has more to do with some of the practical ethics stuff that I've been working on. So there's pretty much everybody will agree that there's a pretty strong relationship between brain states and mental states, such that if you change brain states, you can ultimately change mental states. And if you change the dispositions or the patterns in which the brain functions, you can change mental disposition. So this pretty clearly leads to the idea that if you find ways of intervening in people's brains and say modifying them in some way or other, you can maybe change their behavior in virtue of changing the mental states. That might be assuming a whole bunch of stuff about the mind-brain relationship and stuff, but that's fine. So we already have. So think about like typical psychiatry. So you're diagnosed with depression, you're diagnosed with ADHD, you're diagnosed with something or other. You might be prescribed a drug, and that drug is intended to change some of these mental states. So we're already used to this sort of thing. One idea that, and it's not clearly a new idea, but that's often being discussed now, is the possibility of using interventions in the brains of some offenders, some criminal offenders, to help with the goals of rehabilitating them and reducing rates of recidivism. So this might be by means of drugs. So I think I recently read the estimates of the current estimate that 25 to 40% of male inmates have ADHD. It also turns out that or at least there's a study or more that when they're on medications for ADHD, you might get a significant reduction in crimes or problematic behavior, or what some might call problematic behavior. Likewise, for the use of various other drugs, then there's things that just aren't even drugs, right? So you might get one thing that people are experimenting on is transcranial stimulation. So you basically run electrical currents on a person's skull, which then modifies something going on in the brain, maybe a pattern or something like that. And that might ultimately modify some behavior. It might reduce aggressive impulses. I think in Spain, they just recently ran a pilot study on this. There's further, one technology is called deep brain stimulation, and it's not used for these purposes at all yet, as far as I know. It's the main thing it's used for, I think, is to treat patients with Parkinson's. So what you do is you implant a device deeply inside the brain. And what it does is it sends currents that are meant to counteract other patterns of neural activity, which might, in cases of Parkinson's, might lead to their say convulsions or something like that. If you haven't seen these, a video of somebody turning on a DBS device of a Parkinson's patient turning on it, it's amazing what it can do.
Oh, wow.
And there's some work trying to see if it can work for anorexia nervosa and for depression. Now these are still pretty rudimentary technologies, I take it. They're not super advanced. But the thought is, we're going to keep moving ahead on this. And we're going to get more and more refined ways of modifying brains, and more targeted ways of modifying brains. And then we might use these to modify offenders' mental states. In some cases, it's already used. So, one version is methadone treatment for people that go in with, say, opioid addiction. In some states in the U.S., it's at least legal on the books. In some cases, it's actually used and required. But they're called Anti-Libidonal Interventions, which there's two different ways that they might work. One of them is just by reducing testosterone levels. Another one might be, I can't remember how the other one works. But the idea is to reduce sexual impulses. So for some offenders of particularly egregious sexual offenses, say pedophilia, they might be required to take some anti-libidinal intervention or something like that, with the hope of reducing their sexual desires and their sexual impulses. My paper focuses on non-consensual versions of these because I basically want to apply bypassing views to how these might play out. And if these were consensual, like if the offender said, yeah, I want that, and it was all above board, it wasn't a coercive offer or anything like that, then it wouldn't be an instance of bypassing. And I think it wouldn't clearly be a case where the offender's freedom and responsibility is undermined.
Right.
I have a separate paper on that with Tom Douglas.
Yeah, so on that note, in light of these bypassing views, so let's make it a little more explicit how non-consensual neurocorrectives negatively impact the freedom of their subjects.
Yeah, so I think a few preliminary points. So one, these non-consensual neurocorrectives are going to be quite varied in how they perform. Some of this is just to try to see what reasons we might have in terms of future neurointerventions, but different types of neurointerventions, say different types of drugs or different types of devices, might affect subjects differently. And the same device might affect different subjects differently. So it's really tough to say something general about how neurointerventions do this. So what I try to do is look at what features are going to be relevant and that we might want to look at when it comes to considering a particular instance, to seeing whether it negatively impacts freedom. I also make two assumptions. So one is the main reason in favor of using these is one we've already mentioned. The state has a reason to rehabilitate prisoners and reduce rates of recidivism. And a lot of people point to possible reasons against their use. I suspect that if you have a neurointervention that doesn't help to reduce rehabilitation, and it seems like some anti-libidinal interventions might not be very effective, if effective at all, then it looks like the state doesn't really have substantial reason to use them, and we should probably refrain from using them. The interesting questions are when they have these reasons in favor of using them, and then we have to figure out what the overall balance of reasons is. The second assumption is just that insofar as a non-consensual neurointervention negatively impacts freedom, where that's just understood as whether an agent's action is free or not, maybe for various actions. then we have a reason, maybe not a sufficient reason, maybe just a pro tanto reason, not to use these non-consensual neurointerventions. So, given that I'm focusing on non-consensual neurointerventions, and given that the only interesting ones, I think, are going to be the ones that really do have these effects, then we're already in the territory of interventions that work via bypassing and have effects that might be significant to some extent or other. It really depends on how you flesh out your criteria of significance. And I think that's something that I'd like to work out. So I point to some things that might make it likely that that they negatively impact freedom. So one thing is, again, there is this purpose, there is this reason for rehabilitating and reducing recidivism, in which case, presumably, you're going to want something that has not just mild effects. You want something that has significant effects. Second, as things currently stand, these sorts of interventions, where they are legal, are reserved for particularly heinous crimes. So I think the California statute has it where in the first instance of a particular sort of sexual offense against somebody under the age of 13, it's up to the court's discretion. And on the second instance, it's by mandate. Given that these policies might be selecting for just these particularly heinous crimes, they might often be selecting for particularly heinous criminals. So criminals that it's not like they're typically nice people and they made a mistake or something like that.
Yeah.
So in order to rehabilitate these sorts of criminals, you might think you're going to need to make a fairly significant change.
Right.
It might not be the case for all of these criminals, but here I'm just talking about probabilities. Chances are you're going to need a significant change. In which case, these sorts of neurointerventions are going to be more likely to meet the significance criteria and thereby undermine freedom for actions issuing from modified states.
Yeah.
Now, again, this is just a reason against using them, not necessarily a sufficient reason against using them. But what it does show is that there's this tension between the state's goals and the effects this might have on freedom of action.
Right.
Then there's a second question I consider about supposing that such a non-consensual neurointervention undermines an offender's freedom for some actions or other. How can they regain freedom for their actions? And I think I divide the problem of regaining freedom, which I mentioned earlier, into two different sorts. One is the hard problem, which is the one we discussed. And then there's the easier problem. So in a case where, say, you just implant a single fairly strong desire or something like that, we can come up with an easier solution, largely because the evaluation there will not be influenced by further implanted states. So I offer an account there which kind of takes some ideas from Fisher's version, which is that supposing that the agent has undergone one of these more minor changes and that their evaluation would not be significantly influenced by further implanted states, then one way this could go is that they evaluate it, endorse it, identify with it, so on. And then it looks like they can just act freely from that attitude, even if it was acquired via bypassing. But in other cases, what you might get is the agent recognizes that they have this desire, this mental state. They don't like it. They don't endorse it. They don't identify with it. They want to get rid of it. Yet they still have it. So then I suggest that such an agent would not act freely if it's the case that they have not had an opportunity to reduce or eliminate that attitude, and they have not had the opportunity to learn to reliably resist that attitude. And then there's a further condition, which I'll get into in a bit, but roughly that's the account. It's not a full account because I think I might be missing something there. So these are just when the agent will still not be free. But then supposing that a non-consensual neurointervention that undermines freedom for some actions is relatively targeted, it might be one of these easier cases of regaining freedom. Things get complicated when it comes to side effects. And I go into that in the paper. I guess I shouldn't do it here. So in some cases, you might just have an agent endorsing the acquired attitude, in which case these people can regain freedom fairly quickly. But in other cases, it won't be so clear-cut. And then there's a further tension, right? So insofar as the agent can, say, either eliminate or reduce the strength of the attitudes or learn to reliably resist it, the greater the extent to which they can do that, the less good this intervention is with respect to the state's goals, because the less likely it is to reduce rates of recidivism. So then again, there's this tension of like the more likely the agent is to be able to regain freedom for some of these actions, the less likely that it's going to be good for the state's purposes.
Yeah.
But I suggest that there's a third way of regaining freedom, which is if suppose there's maybe some sort of therapy, other means of rehabilitation, maybe some sort of talking therapy or something like this, which once, say, the first order desires or sexual impulses or something like this have been kind of reduced, which can now be, you can talk to the offender and maybe kind of change their mind about whether they want to have these sorts of attitudes. And that process engages their capacities for control over their mental life.
Yeah.
Then they can now come to endorse these reduced or the reduction in the impulses or the elimination or something like that. In which case they can, again, be free with respect to a lot of these actions.
Interesting, yeah.
Well, that's all been fascinating. Thanks so much for joining us, Gabe. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
So I don't have a website. I have a Google Scholar profile. I have an academia.edu profile. But I guess the main thing is I have a page on the UHERO Center for Practical Ethics, the Oxford UHERO Center, and it's, well, I guess you'll have a link to it, so I won't try to spell it out.
Yeah.
We'll link it.
Okay.
Cool.
Oh, yeah. Thanks again for joining us. This has been awesome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah,
You're
I
welcome.
really appreciate that.
In our next episode, we'll talk with Sophia Jepson about mental illness and moral responsibility.